Hey everybody, Rick Howard here, Chief Security Officer, Chief Analyst, and Senior Fellow at the CyberWire, and I'm so excited to announce the launch of our newest podcast, the CISA Cybersecurity Alerts podcast, a first-of-its-kind audio feed for urgent cybersecurity advisories from the U.S. government. This new podcast is a CyberWire public service to the community and entirely ad-free. You can subscribe wherever you get your podcast, and you will also see them in the CyberWire's Daily Podcast channel. For more information on what the podcast is about, check out our interview with CISA Director Jen Easterly in the CyberWire Daily Podcast episode on May 6th. It's a great one. We invite everyone to share these alerts through their own information channels, and you can contact the CyberWire team to find out how. And subscribe today in your favorite podcast app to the CISA Cybersecurity Alerts podcast.
This episode of the CyberWire is made possible in part by PlexTrack. The best pen testing begins and ends with PlexTrack. Boost efficiency and effectiveness during every phase and cut reporting time in half. PlexTrack helps consultants, service providers, and enterprises centralize processes, build more consistent reports faster, and deliver superior value. PlexTrack users report an average 20% time savings and 30% increase in efficiency. Learn how to spend more time hacking and less time reporting at www.plextrack.com/thecyberwire.
An upswing in malware deployed against targets in Eastern Europe. Cozy Bear is typosquatting. CuckooBees swarm around intellectual property, tracking the DPRK's hackers, quiet persistence in corporate networks. CISA issues an ISC advisory, Caleb Barlow on communications for your business during this period of Shields Up. Duncan Jones from Cambridge Quantum sits down with Dave to discuss the NIST algorithm finalist Rainbow vulnerability. And hey officer, honest, it was just a Squirtle. From the CyberWire studios at Data Tribe, I'm Trey Hester with your CyberWire summary for Wednesday, May 4th, 2022. There's been an upswing in malware deployed against targets in Eastern Europe. The surge is connected with Russia's war against Ukraine. Google's threat analysis group has been tracking the increased activity, much of it traceable to Russia, and especially to Fancy Bear, Russia's GRU military intelligence service, but some of it involving the more or less Russia-aligned Belarusian and Chinese services. Some of Google's key conclusions are, quote, APT-28 or Fancy Bear, a threat actor attributed to Russia's GRU, was observed targeting users in Ukraine with a new variant of malware. The malware, distributed via email attachments inside a password-protected zip file, is a .NET executable that, when executed, steals cookies and saved passwords from Chrome, Edge, and Firefox browsers. Turla, a group tag attributes to Russia FSB, continues to run campaigns against the Baltics, targeting defense and cybersecurity organizations in the region. Similar to recently observed activity, these campaigns were sent via email and contained a unique link per target that led to a docx file hosted on attacker-controlled infrastructure. When opened, the docx file would attempt to download a unique PNG file from the same attacker-controlled domain. Cold River, a Russian-based threat actor, sometimes referred to as Callisto, continues to use Gmail accounts to send credential phishing emails to a variety of Google and non-Google accounts. The targets include government and defense officials, politicians, NGOs, think tanks, and journalists. The group's tactics, techniques, and procedures for these campaigns have shifted slightly from including phishing links directly in the email to also linking to PDFs and/or docs hosted by Google Drive and Microsoft OneDrive. Within these files is a link to an attacker-controlled phishing domain. Ghostwriter, a Belarusian threat actor, has remained active during the course of the war and recently resumed targeting of Gmail accounts via credential phishing. The campaign, targeting high-risk individuals in Ukraine, contained links leading to compromised websites where the first-stage phishing page was hosted. If the user clicked Continue, they would be redirected to an attacker-controlled site that collected the user's credentials. Finally, there's Curious George, who's curious about both sides of the conflict and is prospecting Russian targets as much as any other. Curious George, a group tag attributed to China's PLA-SSF, has remained active against government, military, logistics, and manufacturing organizations in Ukraine, Russia, and Central Asia. In Russia, long-running campaigns against multiple government organizations have continued, including the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Over the past week, TAG identified additional compromises impacting multiple Russian defense contractors, manufacturers, and a Russian logistics company. The initial approach of all of these groups has tended to be through email phishing. Recorded Future describes a cyber espionage campaign operated by Nobelium, that is, Cozy Bear, Russia's SVR foreign intelligence service. The researchers call the command and control infrastructure the SVR is using solar deflection, and they summarize 4 key conclusions about the state and prospects of the campaign. INSIC Group is confident that the identified solar deflection infrastructure can be attributed to the threat activity group publicly reported as Nobelium. This confidence is based on the use of overlapping network infrastructure previously attributed to Nobelium in public reporting, as well as unique variations of Cobalt Strike traditionally used by the group. Broader themes in solar deflection C2 typo squats have included the misuse of brands across multiple industry verticals, particularly in the news and media industries. Cobalt Strike servers related to solar deflection monitoring that were also previously linked to Nobelium activity used modified server configurations, likely an attempt to remain undetected from researchers actively scanning for standard Cobalt Strike server features. Finally, Nobelium has made extensive use of typosquat domain and SSL certificates and will likely continue to use deceptive techniques, including typosquat redirection when using Cobalt Strike tooling. The SVR's mission is the collection of strategic intelligence. It's believed, CyberScoop points out, to have been the agency behind much of last year's SolarWinds exploitation. Typosquatting involves the creation of a domain name that closely resembles one owned and operated by a legitimate organization. Cyberreason Today described CuckooBees, which it characterizes as a massive Chinese cyber espionage effort directed at stealing U.S. firms' intellectual property. Cyberreason attributes the activity with medium to high confidence to China's Winti threat group. Researchers at Trellix reported yesterday that North Korea's army has made another foray into the ransomware market. It's no news that the DPRK has long engaged in financially motivated cybercrime, but Trellix has tied 4 strains of ransomware, BEAF, PXJ, ZZZZ, and Chi-Chi, to Pyongyang's Unit 180, also known as APT-38, and the Lazarus Group. The New Yorker boggles at the group's incredible rise, but Unit 180 has been known for some time. Trellix speculates that the East Asian target set being prospected in these recent campaigns, and the campaign's relatively small and selective scale, suggests that Unit 180 is seeking to determine whether there's a good chance of profit from a resurgent ransomware effort. Mandiant is tracking a cyber espionage group it tracks as UNC 3524 that has taken an interest in corporate email accounts associated with companies engaged in large financial transactions, especially those related to mergers and acquisitions. UNC 3524 is noteworthy for its ability to achieve undetected persistence in targeted networks, an ability Mandiant attributes to the novel backdoor Quiet Exit, which has enabled the threat actor to establish itself for as long as 18 months before being detected. While the researchers find overlaps in technique between the threat actor in both Cozy Bear and Fancy Bear, they so far lack sufficient evidence for definitive attribution. The U.S. Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, yesterday issued an industrial control system advisory for Yokogawa Centum and ProSafe RS. And finally, back in 2017, 2 LAPD police officers failed to respond to a radio call alerting them to a robbery in progress at a California Macy's in the Crenshaw Mall. They later said they never heard the call because there was loud music blasting over the PA system in the Crenshaw Park. But a review of their digital in-car video system told a different story. According to Graham Cluley of Smashing Security, quote, "The truth was, they had deliberately ignored the call for assistance. They weren't interested in catching robbers, they were hunting for Snorlax and Toadjetics," end quote. That is, they were chasing Pokemon. The officers in their defense in the subsequent investigation say they were only talking about the game, not actually playing it. But the Los Angeles Police Department didn't buy that. Let the one who's never tamed a Charmander cast the first Ultra Ball.
And now, a word from our sponsor, Recorded Future. Staying one step ahead of the rapidly evolving threat landscape requires a constant flow of daily intelligence. To stay up to date on everything happening in the world of cybersecurity, join over 50,000 other security professionals who subscribe to the Cyber Daily. With daily email updates on the latest cybersecurity news, top threat actors, exploited vulnerabilities, suspicious IP addresses, and more, the Cyber Daily is the first thing security professionals check every morning. To learn more and subscribe for free, go to recordedfuture.com/cyber-daily. And we thank Recorded Future for sponsoring our show. A substantial amount of research is focused on the realm of quantum computers, systems which take advantage of quantum effects to crunch math problems too difficult for modern conventional computers. NIST is in the midst of evaluating candidates for post-quantum cryptography, trying to strike a reasonable balance between security and interoperability with existing networks. It's what those in the industry refer to as a big deal, and it's not easy. I checked in with Duncan Jones, head of cybersecurity at Cambridge Quantum, for a bit of a reality check.
It's a huge task, to be honest, and it worries me a little how much work lies ahead, because we have to tear out, the guts of almost every cybersecurity system and change to something that is a bit different. It has different properties, behaves slightly differently, different sizes of keys and things. It's not a completely trivial replacement. And what we've discovered in the past when people have tried to do far simpler migrations, so for example, we've seen cryptographic hash functions fall out of favor over recent years. And despite, 5 or 10 years of awareness that something like MD5 is broken, we still see it in use. And that's because it takes a lot of effort to make these changes. And usually for a company, the first challenge is to establish even what they are using today and where they're using it. So I think the next, the most important task companies will be needing to focus on in the next few years is just understanding their estate. Where are they actually using cryptography? What type of cryptography are they using? What data is being protected? Because companies are going to have to prioritize the way that they perform this transition. You can't do everything at once. And so you're going to have to evaluate where are you most at risk and focus your efforts there. And on top of that, speaking to vendors, and that's really important because many companies will have some combination of the things they build themselves and the things they buy in. And those conversations with the vendors need to be starting now, or they should have already started, to really grill them and say, well, what is your strategy for moving your product from where it is today to something that is quantum safe?
Is there a target date that people should focus for? Is there a realistic timeline on this?
So there's two ways to look at that, I think. There is no one agreed date that everybody says, yes, that is the point where we're going to be at risk. And estimates vary widely. I think most people are now starting to settle on 10 or 15 years as a pretty reasonable time frame. Now, one thing, though, that people need to consider is that's maybe the point in time where somebody's going to be sat there with a quantum computer ready to break the data that you're sending around. But something that really concerns some companies is the idea that the data that they are sending today is potentially being recorded patiently by attackers who know this is a long game, but they know that in 10 or 15 years, they can break into the stuff that they recorded today. And so for some companies, that's quite concerning because they know they're sharing data that will still be sensitive and valuable in 10 years. And this is something that is known as a hack now, decrypt later attack. And for that reason, people need to be doing these threat assessments and deciding where are they exposed to that type of risk. Because in those scenarios, they need to move really fast because they may already be too late.
In a world where cryptography is fairly routine these days, we encrypt the contents of our mobile devices, our hard drives, it is routine. We have hardware built into our devices to handle these sorts of things. Is it at all an issue that post-quantum cryptography could be computationally expensive? Have we outstripped that issue? Do we have the computational power that's not going to really cost us anything?
I think for the most part, yes. I think these algorithms are being selected with the understanding that we're going to have to be able to execute them on the equipment that we have. Some specialist equipment is built to speed up these algorithms. And obviously everything that's in the field right now has been geared towards speeding up RSA, for example. That has particular mathematical operations that you have to do, and people have figured out how to do that blazingly fast. So they will, at a hardware level, there will need to potentially be some changes. We'll have to accelerate different types of mathematical problems. But on the whole, people have gone into this with their eyes open. They know that it's not going to be a successful selection process if we end up with algorithms that we just can't use in our day-to-day lives.
Are you optimistic that people are giving this the attention it deserves?
I'm a little nervous. I think people are underestimating both the hack now, decrypt later part of that. I think that's being underestimated or being perceived as kind of science fiction and not a thing that will actually happen. Whereas I think we will genuinely see examples of that happening. And I think they are underestimating or being optimistic about how long it's going to take to perform this migration. So I guess I'm lightly pessimistic is where I'd place myself at the moment.
That's Duncan Jones from Cambridge Quantum. And now, a word from our sponsor, KnowBe4. There's a reason more than half of today's ransomware victims end up paying the ransom. Cybercriminals have become thoughtful, taking time to maximize your organization's potential damage and their payoff. After achieving root access, the bad guys explore your network, reading email, finding data troves, and once they know you, they craft a plan to cause the most panic, pain, and operational disruption. Ransomware has gone nuclear. The folks at KnowBe4 have an on-demand webinar that will get you up to speed on ransomware. In this webinar, you'll find out why data backups, even offline backups, won't save you, why ransomware isn't your real problem, and how your end users can become your best last line of defense. Go to knowbe4.com/ransom to learn more about the webinar. That's knowbe4.com/ransom. And we thank KnowBe4 for sponsoring our show. And I'm pleased to be joined once again by CyberWire contributor Caleb Barlow. Caleb, always great to welcome you back to the show. We are in this period of what CISA is calling shields up, a heightened sense of awareness and security when it comes to cybersecurity things. And I wanted to touch base with you about what this means in terms of strategies for organizations to sustain themselves should the worst happen.
Well, one of the things we have seen, largely not in the U.S., but certainly, the NotPetya, WannaCry, even, the Shamoon attacks that went across oil-producing Gulf states, is when a destructive attack occurs, sometimes even in the case of ransomware, one of the impacts that businesses often see is a loss of communications, right? So loss of email systems, loss of IT and networks, which also often means loss of phones because the phones are usually voice over IP now. So, this can be a rather material secondary impact that a lot of organizations aren't prepared for. And I think as we think about what it means to be shields up, one of the conversations is to think about what are our emergency communications and how do we get in contact with key employees or key locations, both to give direction, but also to get ground truth of what's really going on.
I'm old enough to remember growing up with things like Little League Baseball, and we had phone trees, where if there was a question as to whether the game was going to be canceled because of weather or something like that, you had a phone tree, and so this person would call this person, who call this person, and it just kind of worked. What's the modern equivalent of that? Is there such a thing?
Well, I think we've moved beyond phone trees, although I definitely do remember those, and even though I don't want to date myself.
Right.
But think of it this way, right? A great example of this was when NotPetya hit Maersk, and this is public, their executives were communicating via WhatsApp because it's the only thing that worked. Imagine that, a company that size, and you're now reduced to WhatsApp. So first thing, you need a method of communications that's not on your IT and not on your network. I personally think Slack is a great backup for this, but here's the other point. Make sure that whatever you're using for single sign-on, which probably is dependent on your IT infrastructure, is not what you need to log into that emergency communication system. You want to have an alternative directory that's not on your company's infrastructure. No, you cannot get to SharePoint and your Active Directory when it's all down. So that can be as simple, depending on the size of a company, of having a spreadsheet that you print out and put in your underwear drawer with everybody's cell phone number, right? Or it could be something more complex where, you've got a secondary site that has maybe a copy of your Active Directory in another form so you can get to it if you need to. A lot of companies are using emergency communication systems, similar to what you might have at a school for an active shooter or snow day, where you can reach out to anybody, home, office, cell, it all rings at the same time to be able to say, hey, there's been a cyber incident at work. We need you to get on this, emergency Zoom call. Here's the number. You want to make sure you remember those passcodes. Like, I can't tell you how many, I used to love doing this in kind of like cyber range scenarios where, I'd read their pre-plans, and there would always be, oh, well, in the event of emergency, we'll get on the emergency Zoom meeting. Great. What's the password to that? I have no idea. Like, all right, well, your plan suddenly doesn't work, right? Because you've got no way to give everybody the new number to dial into. The other thing, Dave, is there's something from the Department of Homeland Security called the Government Emergency Telecommunications Service. You can sign up for this if you are a critical infrastructure provider. You can also sign up for it through InfraGard. This will allow you to bypass the phone system, and particularly the cellular network, in order to get access in a 9/11 level incident where, everybody's trying to call everybody.
Right. You get priority access to set aside frequencies, right?
Correct. Or at least access to the network. It's basically a little credit card you carry with you. It doesn't cost anything unless you use it. Now, the advanced class on this, which I've used before, if you have critical sites that you need ground truth on, satellite phones are super cheap now. You can buy a satellite phone with a ridiculously high rate per minute. You don't care if you actually use it. Put a satellite phone at a couple of your locations, and that's going to work even when everything else is down. And the last thing I'll give you is the most extreme example I've ever seen, which was, the geeky side of me thinks was pretty awesome. But it was this large bank I was working with that moved, gazillions of dollars every day. And their concern was, in the event of a major catastrophe, they needed ground truth. Now, that could be everything from a weather event to an explosion to a cyber event. They put a vehicle at an employee's house about 60 minutes away from their major sites. And the deal was, if we can't get to the site, you're to get in the car and drive there and tell us what's going on. And that car had, satellite communications, run books. Now, this was a little expensive, but if you're moving gazillions of dollars a day, you need immediate ground truth to know, do I need to start making decisions? And it kind of gives you the extreme of where you can take this.
Yeah, as a friend of mine puts it, who was in the insurance business, he said, imagine a Wile E. Coyote smoking hole in the ground. You got to know if that's what you're up against or not, right?
Well, and the point from this bank was, look, if there is a Wile E. Coyote hole in the ground, we know what to do. We know how to start moving operations to different locations, but we don't want to start that process if it's, somebody hit a telephone pole outside of the business and the power will be back up and running in 20 minutes. Those are two very different decisions. But if you don't have ground truth, you don't know what to do. And for them, spending, $50,000 on a Ford Explorer to get the information was a drop in the bucket relative to the cost of making the wrong decision.
Right. You hope you never need it, but if you're in that situation, boy, that's the last point in time when you want to be trying to make those decisions, right? In the heat of the moment.
Well, and my point here is if you can't communicate, you can't put it together. I mean, that's the most basic thing here is you can put a lot together just, kind of rolling with it if you can communicate. If you can't communicate, you're a fish in a barrel.
Right. All right. Well, certainly food for thought. Caleb Barlow, thanks for joining us. Thanks to all of our sponsors for making the CyberWire possible, especially our supporting sponsor, CyberReason. Ransomware shouldn't feel inevitable. You should feel invincible. CyberReason is undefeated against ransomware with the only predictive ransomware protection available. It's the ultimate defense against ransomware. Visit cyberreason.com to learn more. Thank you also to our friends at RSA Conference, where the world talks security. Through global events and year-round content, RSAC connects you to cybersecurity leaders and cutting-edge ideas for a safer, more secure future. Learn more at rsaconference.com/cyberwire22.
And that's the CyberWire. For links to all of today's stories, check out our daily briefing at thecyberwire.com. The CyberWire podcast is proudly produced in Maryland out of the startup studios of DataTribe, where they're co-building the next generation of cybersecurity teams and technology. Our amazing CyberWire team is Liz Irvin, Elliot Peltzman, Brandon Karp, Eliana White, Pru Prakash, Justin Sabi, Tim Nodar, Joe Kerrigan, Pearl Terrio, Ben Yellen, Nick Vlecki, Gina Johnson, Bennett Moe, Chris Russell, John Petrick, Jennifer Ivan, Rick Howard, Peter Kilpie, and I'm Trey Hester, filling in for Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here tomorrow.
And now, a word from our sponsor, CyberReason. They're out there, and they're coming for you. Ransomware attackers, sophisticated criminal armies bringing organizations to their knees and costing companies millions. But ransomware shouldn't feel inevitable. You should feel invincible. CyberReason is undefeated in the fight against ransomware with the only predictive ransomware protection available, automatically stopping attacks before encryption and empowering security teams with full visibility. It's the ultimate protection against ransomware, an AI-powered defense that defeats ransomware at every stage of the attack, stopping today's threats and ready for tomorrow's. True cyber defense designed for true defenders. Because ransomware won't define this era, those who defeat it will. Visit cyberreason.com to learn more. That's cybereason.com. And we thank CyberReason for sponsoring our show.